Chapter 8. There were over 100 gallons in the cabin. He pumped for a time and counted them, figuring that he worked the pump about 30 times a minute. So 100 minutes would be 3,000 pumps. 100 minutes, and there was still a lot of water in the cabin. The boat didn't even feel much lighter, still lay heavily in the shallow swells. After perhaps 4 hours, his right arm ached with the effort. She at last lightened. The water was a shallow puddle in the middle of the cabin floor. Another half hour and the hose was making slurping noises, and he stopped. The dampness left in the floor carpet would evaporate in the sun's heat. It was evening now. The sun was low over the water. In the entire day there had not been one breath of wind, and the sails still hung where he had jammed them before the storm. He had to get them up, aired out and stowed correctly, or at least tied in place, but he found that he could not move. His left shoulder still hurt. Somehow working the pump with his right arm had aggravated the left one as well, and his head still hurt from the boom injury. But it wasn't that so much as just plain exhaustion. He felt wrecked. She was floating right. He had given one hand for the ship, and now he just simply could not move. He sat on the left seat of the cockpit and leaned against the back cabin wall and closed his eyes and slept. And sleep took him as if he'd been hit with a soft hammer. Not long, half an hour, perhaps a bit more. He kept looking at his watch once he was conscious, but it was still blank, and he came suddenly awake. Like that, as fast as he'd gone to sleep. He had a crick in his neck from leaning against the cabin side, and he stood and stretched, felt his neck pop a bit, then carefully reached and stretched his left arm. It would go shoulder high, no higher. That would have to do. He stepped up to the side rail and moved forward to the mast. The halyards still hung loose, tangled with each other, and the loosened jib sheets. Owen would have been furious if he could have seen the mess, and using mostly his right arm for the effort, he untangled the ropes and pulled the mainsail back up, feeding it out of the cabin roof gently to keep it from sagging. It was sopping, but the Dacron wouldn't rot or soak up water and would dry rapidly out in the open. The air was so still that the sail hung without even gentle huffing. He had never seen it this calm, without even the customary soft breeze, which Owen had told him came when the evening cool met with the day heat and caused air movement. And he cleated the halyard off easily. He went back down into the cabin and opened the front hatch to loosen the pinch jib. It took him several minutes, using only his right hand to push the jib back out and onto the deck. He'd push up a handful and it would fall back on him. Then he went topside again and hoisted the jib, which hung as dead as the main. The inside of the boat was still a frightful mess, with garbage and dampness all around. But the Frog was at least a boat again, floating high on the slick calm of the swells, her sails up and drying, one hand for the ship. Thirsty again, it came just that way. He was thirsty, and he took another cupful of water from the hand pump at the sink. How could he be thirsty in the middle of the whole ocean? His mouth felt as if he'd been in the desert. One cup didn't seem to be enough as he drank another, then remembered that he didn't know how much water there was in that tank. As soon as his thirst was pushed down, the hunger came up. He had not eaten for 2 days, and his stomach seemed to have turned in on itself. In the middle of the cabin floor, rolling back and forth, was a can of bite-sized raviola. He found the can opener back under the cockpit, jammed up in the corner of the captain's bunk. When he figured the angle, the boat had to roll and pitch to flip out the locked-in silverware drawer, tip it over, and dump the can opener that far away. That back of his neck stiffened with fear. She must have been well past sideways, headed for a complete rollover. It didn't seem possible for the Frog to have gone over that far without filling and sinking, and he was almost glad he'd been unconscious when it happened. "There are some things it's better not to know," he whispered in the cabin. "Better just to let 'em be." It took another minute to find a spoon. Knives, forks, and spoons were scattered all over before he could sit down to eat. Then it was almost a religious experience. He took out each bite-sized raviola, held it in his mouth, and chewed slowly and lovingly, sitting in the cockpit. Then swallowed it, hesitating a moment before taking another bite. It was the first time in his life he had really been hungry. Owen and his parents had spoken of hunger, world hunger, and he had seen shows on hunger, but he had never really been without food for any length of time, never over a few hours. He found two things happening to his thinking. First, he became angry. There was no sense to it, but the hunger made him angry, as though it were a personal attack on him. And the second feeling was that he loved food. Not just liked it, he loved it. It tasted so fine. The junky little can of raviola bites tasted so incredibly fine that it made his temples hurt while he chewed. He wanted to keep the ravioli forever, keep it and cherish it and eat it at the same time. He took over an hour to eat the canful. Around him the evening came down. The sun seemed to hurl itself from the western sky into the distant sea, the ocean cooling the air with the sun gone, though still without wind, until he felt the chill and went below for his coat, his jacket. His eyes kept closing. He sat outside for a while, wishing it were not getting dark. Something about coming darkness frightened him, and his eyes kept closing. "It's not that I'm tired," he said to himself aloud. Not so tired, but his eyes kept closing, and finally he leaned against the cabin wall, sitting in the cockpit, and dozed again, and would have slept, except that after a few minutes it became uncomfortable. He went down inside the boat and stretched out on the captain's bunk. The cushion was still sopping wet, but he didn't care any longer and was almost instantly asleep, sure that nothing would awaken him until daylight. His eyes snapped open in the near darkness. The inside of the boat was bathed in pale white light coming from the moon through the cabin windows and rear hatch opening. He lay still on the bunk, feeling the frog ride lightly on the waves, listening intently. There was silence, complete silence, not even the sound of water working against the sound of the side of the boat. Stone silence in the moonlight, and no reason that he should have sprung awake the way he did. For a time his eyes were wide open, and he listened with his breath held, and when he saw nothing, heard nothing, felt nothing, he closed his eyes and started to drift back to sleep, and would have gone under, except that just as his brain began to shut down, the world exploded. There was a horrible scraping sound, like somebody dragging a claw down the whole length of the boat, a sharp rake or claw, dragging it from the end to end, and when the sudden roar of the scraping in the boat it seemed to be magnified. The hull took a jolt that rocked the frog to the side. A small jolt, then another large one, another small one, and the scraping grew fainter and was gone. Silence again. It happened so fast, was so stunned, that David had no time to react except to suck in half a breath and hold it in terror. He now rolled out of the bunk, the pain in his arm and head forgotten, and scrambled through the rear hatch onto the deck. The boat rocked gently for a moment, then settled back into stillness. There was no breeze, and he could see nothing floating on the water in the moonlight around her. Silence. He climbed up on the cabin and held the mast, stepped on both sides, and studied the surface of the water. Nothing moving, nothing showed, nothing. Still, he thought, something had been there. He hadn't dreamed it, or had he? He was in that time of sleep when the mind plays tricks, just before deep sleep. Maybe that was it. Maybe it was some kind of dream or hallucination. People did that sometimes, hallucinated. He had been half asleep and had imagined the whole thing. That had to be it. He moved slowly back into the cockpit. There had been the scraping against the hull. Surely, if that had been real, it would have left some scratches on the side of the boat. Kneeling on the edge of the cockpit seat, He hung onto the lifeline with his right hand and leaned out so that he was hanging over the water about a foot and a half above the surface, and tried peering down the side of the hull in the moonlight. The water beneath his face seemed to have darkness of its own, a deep darkness, a whole world of darkness in depths. At first he could see nothing but the shine on the fiberglass in the dull light of the fiberglass in the dull light. Then he refocused. His eyes squinted, and there, a line. No, there were 4 or 5 of them. Scratches or gouges that went from about 3 feet along the side of the boat, curving sideways and down into the water. It looked as if a giant claw had come out of the water, raked along the boat, and then disappeared back into the sea. He hadn't dreamed it, and everything to him wanted it to be a dream now that he saw the marks. And the thought that he hadn't dreamed about the sound and the lurching of the boat was almost his last. Out of the corner of his eye, just below him, David caught the faintest swirl of movement in the deep shadows of the water. Later, he couldn't be sure if it was truly a shadow of the water itself. But whatever it was, it gave him a slight fraction of a second's warning, and he began to pull his head back. The water detonated, surged up at his face, and a shark's gaping teeth flashing in the moonlight, triangular death razor-like sharp teeth, blew up and out of the darkness, slashed past his face in a ripping sideways motion, and savagely raked down the side of the hull, slamming against the side of the boat so hard that it knocked the frog sideways. Not over a second, and it was gone. Silence. David had thrown himself backward into the cockpit and lay on his back with his head out the other side of the boat over the water. He realized suddenly that he was exposed and jerked back into the middle to sit in wide-eyed terror, staring at the calm surface around the boat. Phew! The air whistled out of his lungs. He took another deep breath, and without meaning to held it for about a half of a minute, waiting, but nothing came. Nothing made a sound. He was shaking, his whole body trembling. Out of nowhere, with no warning, to explode that way and slash at him. Or maybe not at him, but close to him. To come that way and attack the side of the boat while his head hung out over the water? Like bait, he thought. I was like bait. And to think I used to dive with Owen. If it had wanted me, truly wanted me, it could come right into the cockpit. Shark. Just the word hit him. Shark. The mouth looked large enough to take his head off. Shark. When he thought of it coming out of the black depths that way, coming out of the darkness like something evil, his breath came in a tight little jerk. He could think only of being taken down and taken into the blackness. To be snatched off the boat and taken down alone, completely alone in the world, down into the inky darkness? No, he thought, I have to stop this. What happened, really? It's not like Jaws, not really. A fish, a big fish with lots of teeth. Big fish, just the same. Hit the side of the boat, and I happened to be leaning over the water when it hit. It might have even been after me. I just happened to be leaning there. It could have been just hitting the boat. Wham! As if sensing his thoughts, the shark hit again, crashing against the side of the frog, pushing it sideways, ripping new fear through him. He almost screamed, but this time he controlled the fright faster and realized that he'd been right. It was hitting the boat, was not after him, and while he thought of it, the shark, hit once more, then again, on the same side of the boat, but slightly forward. David went below into the cabin and felt the hull of where the shark had hit and found that there was no damage. While he was inside, it struck a 6th time, still on the port, left side of the boat just above the waterline, and he could feel the hull flex with the blow. It didn't make any sense. He had almost heard sharks were attracted to blood in the water, blood or meat or garbage, but there wasn't anything on that side of the boat to attract a shark. It was just a clean blue-white surface. Wait a minute. He studied the moon again. It was low and over the left side of the boat. so that the light reflected from the moon bouncing off the left side of the hull and down into the water. From below, it must seem to be something flashy, just on the surface of the water. And he had read someplace, no, he had heard it in a talk at Marineland, that sharks would sometimes hit flashing light or movement because it is similar to the flash of a wounded fish when it rolls. Knowledge, he thought, even as the shark hit again, is everything. As Owen had said, Owen who had wanted to know all there is, knowledge was for times like this, David thought, rolling with the shark's attack. To have knowledge makes anything endurable. It's everything. The shark stayed near the boat for 3 more hours, hitting it more and more infrequent intervals, until the moon was straight over the mast and no light reflected from the hull. Then the attack stopped completely, and David went back to the captain's bunk to sleep the rest of the night without awakening until the morning sun baked the inside of the cabin.